back, and in our second segment we're going to talk about human trafficking. Now, as far as the definition of human trafficking is concerned, there are different, but the main crux is that it's the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring or receipt of people through force, fraud or deception with the aim of exploiting them for profit. We've seen a lot of that happening recently in the past few years as well. We all have also seen the latest report that has come as far as the migrant boat capsizing on the coast of Italy is concerned, and the probe that the FIA is also going to make as far as this incident is concerned. That and more will be part of this important segment. We've been joined by two important guests. Let me introduce them to you one by one. In the studios, we've been joined by Dan Nash. He's the co-founder of Human Trafficking Training Center. Dan, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having
welcome to Pakistan. Our next guest is Alison Phillips. She's a professor at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, Wizard of Oz. Alison, welcome to our show.
Thank
you. Welcome to Pakistan as well. I hope we are treating you well.
Indeed, yes.
Dan, let's begin with you. What should be the new approaches as far as combating human trafficking is concerned? We've seen a lot of developments, whether it be on the United Nations, whether it be in the United States, whether it be in Africa, whether it be in Asia. But the modalities of human traffickers change with the times. How should the world change itself accordingly in order to curb trafficking?
Well, first of all, it would be getting to a point where we can try to prevent trafficking. We always want to prevent it before it happens. But then from a perspective, once it's happening, I think the most important thing is probably two things, and that is number one, historically, governments all across the world have not always thought of the trafficking victims as victims themselves, because sometimes they're forced to do these crimes, and sometimes we end up arresting the victims. So not doing that, not treating the victims as though they are a suspect. And then secondly, we see this all across the world, and that is we have to properly train our police, because the police are really on the front lines of being able to identify trafficking, being able to identify the traffickers, and really being able to stop trafficking.
Alison, when one looks at your profile, it's quite interesting. You've researched trafficking victims, you've ran to non-profits working with victims of human trafficking as well. What is the basic crux of the mentality of the victims of human trafficking that you've encountered?
So one of the things that we try to teach about human trafficking that I think is helpful to understand is that very rarely are victims actually kidnapped or abducted into this. Usually what comes before it is a long seasoning of psychological manipulation, brainwashing, and so forth. And the entire purpose of that is to make the victim come to a place where they really blame themselves for getting into the situation. They think it's their fault. And so they don't necessarily think of themselves as a victim. They think they're in some kind of bad situation, certainly, but may not necessarily be aware of the violation of their human rights.
Dan, what in your point of view are the best international practices as far as tackling trafficking in person is concerned? And what are the recent anti-trafficking mechanisms that are at play, for example, in the United States? Do you feel there are certain policy gaps that lead to lacunas that the traffickers take advantage of?
So one of the first things that I think any country would need to do, and that is to have some type of trafficking law that will deal with trafficking and give the police and prosecutors the tools that they need to be able to stop trafficking. So here in Pakistan, you guys passed that law in 2018. It's almost identical to the laws that we have in the United States that we passed and what other countries are doing. And that consistency is really important, because some of this is definitely in country and then some of it is out of country, with organized crime networks rolling through Europe and to the United States and different places. So to have similar laws on the books in places like Pakistan, places like Europe, places like the United States is a really good first step.
All right. In your point of view, Alison, are you satisfied by the policies that have been implemented by Pakistan so far? Dan has highlighted the policy in 2018, the law that has been passed by Pakistan in 2018. As far as strengthening institutional capacity or collaboration of various stakeholders is concerned, what more needs to be done by countries such as Pakistan?
So I think Pakistan is off to a great start. I think the laws that were passed in 2018 are a good foundational point. The conference that has been here the last 2 days is also a very good step to bring together parliamentarians, law enforcement, academia, social service organizations. To bring all of those people together in a room together is a tremendous accomplishment. It's not something that we are able to do or see in the United States, but it's very much necessary if we want to increase our capacity. For each agency to be successful, we have to learn to work together, and so bringing them together for a conference like this is beautiful.
Dan, speaking of this conference, the 2-day conference ended today. What would you take out? What would be the crux of this 2-day conference as far as the different discussions that were held by the different parliamentarians, as Alison pointed out? What has been retained by yourself, by Alison, after these 2 days?
2 things for me, and the first is what I saw is the same problems that you have in Pakistan are the same problems that we have in the United States, and the same problems that I think most countries around the world are having. It doesn't matter what part of the world you live in, but the problems with human trafficking are really the same. And then secondly, it was very positive, like Alison said, having all these different groups there together. And during the sessions that we were leading, there were groups of police and there were groups of other people, and historically, and this happens everywhere around the world, these different groups work in their own little silos and not really working together. So one of the things that we discussed was there are certain law enforcement in Pakistan that they weren't sharing information together. So they didn't know what that law enforcement was doing, and this law enforcement didn't know what that was doing. And being able to improve things like that is a really big deal, because then all the law enforcement together might be able to know that that person is a trafficker or that person is a trafficker. And when they move from province to province, it's much easier for law enforcement to deal with.
Alison, being a woman, I mean, I don't want to be asking questions about women and children, but this is a question that comes to mind when I think of you, because you have talked to so many victims. Why are women and children most of the victims of human trafficking, A? And how does it impact the female gender as far as children as well? How are they more vulnerable to the traffickers?
Yes, and that's really human trafficking, regardless of whether it's the United States or Pakistan or anywhere in the world. It really comes down to exploitation of vulnerability. And so certainly, of course, women and children have more vulnerabilities. And in cultures where women's rights are not as recognized, that also increases vulnerabilities.
All right. Dan, we all have read or seen the incident of the migrant boat capsizing on the coast of Italy. The FIA, this is a Pakistani organization, has launched a probe into the network of traffickers that are responsible for sending Pakistani migrants abroad who died after their boat sank off the coast in this Italy. How significant, in your point of view, is this coordination mechanism between organizations such as the FIA with other organizations in order to A, understand the modalities of human trafficking in Pakistan, and B, to stop human traffickers before they move on and cause damage, A, to people through deaths, or to laws through human trafficking?
That's very crucial and very important. Being able to have your local police and FIA cooperate and share information and work together, create a task force, so to speak, to stop human trafficking, which is one of the things that came out of this conference the last couple of days, was creating a national task force to combat human trafficking. And then being able to work together with your NGOs, your non-governmental organizations that are providing services, because even if you prevent a trafficking incident, now you have these victims that need help. They need all kinds of different services, and that's something that the police are not set up to do. So being able to have those partners that you can then call and say, okay, we found these trafficking victims, now we need your help to provide them the services that they need.
Speaking of help, Alison, you have trained thousands of officers as far as human trafficking is concerned. The human traffickers use updated technology, especially with the onset of social media, digital media. They use that a lot. Do you feel you could evolve a mechanism for countries such as Pakistan as well to train the police officers, to train the officers in the FIA, so that they understand the latest modalities that the human traffickers use?
Yes, and that's actually something that we try to emphasize in our trainings is understanding the ways in which traffickers use these various tools and understanding them. And it's almost kind of the analogy I would give. It's like studying a professional sports team would study the opposing team they're going to play next week. We learn their plays, we understand what their strengths and weaknesses are, and we use that to our advantage. And that's the kind of mindset that we want to encourage in law enforcement, is to go into the game with a winning mentality. not
That
just
is
show up
wonderful.
for it.
Dan, some basic questions, layman questions, let's put it that way. How is human trafficking different from migrant smuggling?
So smuggling by itself is a crime against a country's sovereignty. It's a crime against the country itself, whereas human trafficking is a crime against that person. So an example would be, I could pay you money and I can consent to you smuggling me across the border, but I cannot consent to being trafficked, just like I cannot consent to being murdered, right? So it's a crime against a person versus a crime against a country. And while they're completely different crimes, does it make me more vulnerable if I'm if I'm a smuggling, being smuggled by you? Does it make me more vulnerable to trafficking? Well, for sure it does, because maybe you say it's going to cost me $5,000 to get across the border, but then when I get across the border, you say no. Now it's going to cost you $20,000, or you're going to have to do this, or you're going to have to do that. So it makes them very vulnerable.
Alison, as far as the United Nations Trafficking in Persons Protocol is concerned, the consent of the victim to the exploitation is irrelevant with the threat or the use of force and deception. Is this still applied in principle across the world, including in Asia and Africa and other countries, or the people that you have encountered, the victims that you have talked to?
No, it isn't. And so this is where we have a difference between the laws that are implemented, the laws that are established and put in place, and the ways in which they're implemented. And so that's why we really emphasize that it's not enough to make good laws. You have to partner or couple those laws with training so that the people who will be using them, mainly law enforcement and the prosecutors and judges, understand what the law, how it's defined, and what powers it gives and what it doesn't. And the analogy I use, it's like giving tools to a carpenter, but if they have no training on how to use the tools, they will just sit in the toolbox.
So training is primordial. Training is extremely important. And I hope the message has gone across to the relevant quarters in Pakistan.
Exactly. And when law enforcement in particular is trained, it is a total game changer.
Dan, when you look at the statistics as far as the traffickers are concerned, most are male, most are young. Why? Why is there a certain age bracket, related to human traffickers, not the victims, but the perpetrators?
I think that comes down to the criminality part, right? What we see in the United States, and I'm sure you see that here, is that most of the individuals that are committing crimes are younger. That doesn't mean that we don't have older males that are committing some crimes, but if you look at the makeup of the prison system, you look at the makeup of crimes across the board, most criminals have a tendency to be younger, right? So as persons get involved in criminal activity, they're already younger. Consequently, the traffickers are younger.
Alison, I'd also like to understand how widespread, in your point of view, is human trafficking. According to the data that I saw that pertains to 2020 and given by the United Nations, in 2018 there were 50,000 human trafficking victims reported in 148 countries. Yes. Between 2020 and 2023, has that number increased? Has the number of countries that are involved increased?
The experts who estimate how many victims of human trafficking we have across the world, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, other forms of it, do tell us that the estimates are on the rise. What I think is most important for people to keep in mind are not necessarily the numbers that these statistics give us. It's that in terms of dollars, human trafficking is the second most pervasive crime on earth, behind the illegal trade in drugs. And if we think about the impact and the visibility of drugs on any society, it's significant. We can all see that. And here we have this crime second to it. And at least in the United States, I sit in front of crowds of people all the time, and they are shocked to learn that this is something that is happening in their midst.
She talked about some of the forms of human trafficking. What are the basic forms that you have encountered, Dan, of human trafficking since you've been associated with it?
So what most people think of is when they think of human trafficking is what we see on movies or social media, yes, and that is sex trafficking or labor trafficking. But there's really more to that, because really what trafficking is just forced criminality. It's forcing someone to commit a crime so that I can profit from that. So things that we see very commonly in the United States is not only sex trafficking and labor trafficking, but we see a trafficker forcing someone to be a drug trafficker, a trafficker forcing someone to illegally use stolen credit cards, a trafficker forcing someone to commit robberies, a trafficker forcing someone to steal or beg on the street. It's forcing people to do a variety of different crimes that we refer to as just forced criminality. And historically, law enforcement has missed that. And we end up arresting a victim maybe because they're using this credit card without knowing that behind the scenes, the trafficker is forcing them to do that.
All right, Alison, last two questions, one from you and the last from Dan. What are the kinds of industries that are affected by human trafficking?
What kind of industries are, I would say, particularly with labor trafficking, you will see that in unskilled labor pools. You'll see it in agriculture work, you'll see it in factory work, construction, any kind of jobs where you have pools of unskilled labor. That's where you'll see a lot of that. In the United States, a lot of what happens through sex trafficking will overlap with commercial sex businesses, things like pornography, strip clubs, and so forth. It overlaps into it.
All right, and finally from Dan, I'll ask you two questions. This question is in two parts, and I'd like a quick snappy answer to that. What is the role of transnational organized crime groups in human trafficking? This is the first part of my question. The second part is, do most of the traffickers get caught, apprehended, and convicted?
I'm going to answer the second part of that question first, and the answer to that is no. And that really comes down to lack of training. If you don't have training, the police can't catch them, and the prosecutors have to be trained to prosecute them. So the answer is no. A very small percentage of them are caught and prosecuted. And the first question is yes. We see multinational and transnational organizations that do a lot of human trafficking. In the United States, we have that down to basically 5 main groups, and 4 of the 5 are transnational groups. So yes, that happens everywhere.
Final question, quick answer from the both of you. Is there a legal instrument apart from the UN protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in persons that was passed in 2000? Do we need to have more such instruments and protocols into place across the world? I'll start with you, Alison.
So in the United States, when we first enacted our trafficking in persons law in 2000, that law has been reauthorized many times. It's been over 20 years. And what happens through that is we take the initial framework and we build upon it as our nation makes progress. And so I would recommend that as Pakistan builds up their response to human trafficking, that they similarly adjust as they move along.
Dan.
I would agree with that. Because the criminality is fluid and is constantly evolving, the law needs to constantly evolve to match that. Unfortunately, the law is usually behind the criminality, but as you grow, you need to constantly move.
And for that, we have conferences such as the one that you took part in, this 2-day conference, and I hope that a lot of concrete results will emanate out of this as far as collaboration is concerned, as far as understanding of what human trafficking is and how we can combat it together as the nations or together as one entity of the global body. Thank you so very much, Dan Nash. Thank you so very much, Alison Phillips, to have joined us and to have talked to us about so many different aspects of human trafficking. I wish we had more time, and I hope we get to meet again soon to talk about more aspects of human trafficking. Thank you very much to the both of you. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of today's newsroom. We'll see you inshallah tomorrow with news stories, segments that pertain to us, you and Pakistan. Stay safe. Allah Hafiz.